my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. I'm Indu Saxena, Chief Operation Officer and Senior Fellow at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. I'm delighted to see some of my colleagues and consortium mentors who I have been working with a long time at distinguished colleagues at this event in person, and it's great to see you. And I hope I'm very pleased to see those who have joined us the first time here at this event. Thank you. Just a few words about the consortium. The Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers is a nonprofit, independent organization with members from the Pacific Ocean region to the Indian Ocean region. Our team spearheads qualitative and multidisciplinary research on Indo-Pacific security and peace, CIPR partners with universities and like-minded partners, and provide a platform for young scholars, practitioners, service members, and subject matter experts to engage in deliberations and dialogues on Indo-Pacific affairs. In a short period of time, our dedicated team has garnered recognition across continents for its extensive work. Thank you for your support for this. Today's event is centered on U.S. Japan alliance, strengthening defense and security in the Indo-Pacific. In fact, today we are gathered here to discuss the findings of our ongoing project, U.S. Japan alliance, and they are strengthening and enhancing on defense and security aspect, and that culminated towards fruition, and we are able to produce in a short preliminary report, and subsequently we will publish the detailed work. For the report launch, a kind of sort of report launch event, I would invite in a few minutes to U.S. Japan Foundation, Mr. Jacob Schlesinger, who is with us. Before diving into the substance, I want to express my gratitude to the U.S. Japan Foundation, whose support has been instrumental in making this event possible. We would not have been here without their support. And as I already mentioned, Foundation's president is here with us. Thank you, Jake, for the incredible support. In this project, we proposed 3 research areas of U.S.-Japan alliance, looking at the defense and security aspect. When we submit this proposal to the foundation, I guess it's September 30th, 2024. So there was a lot of things that we mentioned in our proposal. And since then, the time had changed. A lot of things had changed. Still, we see a kind of optimism and hope for the commitment for the alliance and the partnership in the coming days that we are going to discuss it in a few minutes. So I just want to let you know the 3 areas of research here is, the first area of research is evolution of U.S.-Japan alliance, strategic coordination and potential hurdles. In this area, our contributor or the presenter will see the present, past, and future of the alliance and what are the hurdles or the challenges ahead in the alliance. The second research area is U.S.-Japan joint response to China's gray zone activities. And the third research area is the future of U.S.-Japan alliance, pivots in defense planning. Our project contributors have written an extensive paper on each area and will present their work shortly. Moving forward, let me set the stage for today's discussion. From the turbulent time of 1951 in San Francisco, the United States and Japan signed the peace treaty and revised it in 1960, the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security. Till today, The uncertain times of 21st century, US and Japan have been working together to deter the common threat. The US-Japan quote, ironclad alliance has evolved bilaterally, trilaterally, and in quadrilateral partnership to reiterate its commitment to deter the adversary from the Far East to the Indo-Pacific. Emphasizing the US-Japan alliance, quote, a cornerstone of Indo-Pacific security, the robust partnership seeks to re-establish the deterrence to face the challenges of aggression and coercion in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Looking over the complex security environment from Tibet to Taiwan, from Senkaku to Spratly, and more broadly in the Indian Ocean, the concerning elements are the forces of aggression and coercion and their no-limit partnership code, as we see in the Ukraine war, and the vulnerability of the ongoing talks of peace deal. Further, North Korea's advancing missile program and Russia and North Korea cooperation and China's offensive maneuvering poses a threat to security and stability in the Indo-Pacific region, where Taiwan is a flashpoint. However, there is some anxiety and concerns regarding the alliance commitment to changing environment. As we all know, the tariff tensions all over in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. The discussions are going on the trade tariffs. Some of the partners and the allies feeling uneasy with the US ongoing tariff, though it is said that the tariffs are to reduce the disparity in the trade relations. The second thing that we need to focus on the defense, increase in defense spending and burden sharing. That is also a bit of concerning for the partners and in fact allies too. These are the tough questions for the alliance and partners to walk through. Again, it seems that the Quad, that we have seen a robust quadrilateral non-military formation of group in the recent months, particularly the members of the Quad, Australia, and also India, approaching to China to avoid the tariff heat despite their concern of China's assertive actions in Tasman Sea and the Himalayas. Furthermore, US involvement to Israel, Hamas, and Iran, and the consistent threat from the extremist group that also take the US resources and the investment of time to get a little bit of destruction from the Indo-Pacific. That's my view. I would like to hear what you say on about this. Additionally, what I feel that the weightage of the domestic politics here in the United States and of course in the partner countries too has its say too. So while talking all these points, and to sum up, in next 2 hours, we will ponder upon the questions of US priorities and the reason of key focus is the Indo-Pacific, how much we see if it's changed or it's not changed. I hear the both sides of the argument. So we will discuss it in a while. That is something that I am thinking or I am overthinking what kind of US involvement will be in case of contingency in the East China Sea or the South China Sea. We have, for all these points to discuss, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers who have multitude of experience and expertise on the topic to build and understand the nuances of U.S.-Japan alliance, and more specifically, alliance interest can best fit in the U.S. interest in the Indo-Pacific. Having said that, just moving to the next next stage, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker. And before I introduce him, I would like to let you know that we have the report, so we will just distribute the report for that, and I would be happy to have Jake here at the podium. So I'm introducing today's sponsor of this event and the president of U.S. Japan Foundation, Mr. Jacob M. Schlesinger. He is I told you, CEO and the president of the foundation, and he is a fellow at Distinguished Career Institute, Stanford University. Before DCI, Jake worked for more than 30 years as a reporter and editor for the Wall Street Journal in Washington, D.C., Tokyo, and Detroit. At the Journal, he covered economic and economic policy, chronicled elections and summits, trade wars and market crashes, labor strikes, the 9/11 terror attacks, the U.S. and Japan's March 2001 triple disaster of earthquake, tsunami, and Fukushima nuclear meltdown. Jake was the Journal's Tokyo bureau chief and deputy Washington bureau chief and the global financial regulation editor. He is the author of Shadow Shoguns, The Rise and Fall of Japan's Post-War Political Machine. While writing that book, he was a fellow at Stanford's Asia-Pacific Research Center. He was later a Stigler Center journalist in residence at the University of Chicago. Jake was a member of the Journal team, winning the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting on the dot-com bubble and crash. In 2014, he was given Stanford's Shorenstein Journalism Award, presented annually to a reporter helping global audience understand the complexity of the Asia-Pacific region. Jake, please, I would like to invite you at the podium.
And so I also want to actually start by saying that I am quite humbled to be here, especially to be listed as the keynote speaker, especially because, to be totally honest, I have far less experience in this area than any of you. Even though Indu was kind to read my biography, what you might have noticed is my career as a journalist is largely in the area of economic policy, less so in security and defense. And so I see my main role here is to listen and to learn. So I'm not here as an expert, but as Indu said, as a sponsor, as a funder. So I want to use my time to explain the motivation of my organization, the United States Japan Foundation, for supporting this event and projects like it, and what we hope to get out of this discussion and similar ones in the coming weeks and months. So at one level, the motivation is very clear, of course. As is well documented in the report and in these papers, the threat matrix in the Asia-Pacific is changing dramatically. What Professor Hinata Yamaguchi calls an increasingly hostile security environment, driven in large part by the increasingly aggressive and sophisticated tactics of China. Colonel Holman in his paper documents that development very well in his examination of China's gray zone tactics. And as the concept note explains in the very beginning of this report, it says that the alliance has taken on increasing significance due to China-Russia collaboration, and North Korea's advancing missile program. So that all raises the stakes for the U.S.-Japan alliance, and one core concern that both Professor Sato and Hinata Yamaguchi raise in their papers is the ongoing constraint on Japan due to Article 9's Peace Clause of the Japanese Constitution and the broader legacy of post-war pacifism. While that has eased considerably in recent years, it still imposes limits on just how much Japan can respond to an increasingly dangerous situation. So all of that is shaping and testing the United States-Japan relationship, and that's naturally of interest to an organization whose name is, after all, the United States-Japan Foundation. And yet, all of those topics have been around for some time, and while the details are always evolving, they fall into a basic analytical framework that has been stable for many years. I would like to encourage this conversation, in addition to the importance of reviewing all of those topics, to give an additional emphasis to an additional theme, one that I think has the potential to blow up the framework. And that is to focus more on a new destabilizing element in the U.S. Japan relationship and in the region, and Indu alluded to this in her opening remarks herself, the radical transformation unfolding before our very eyes in the foreign and defense policies of the United States. American governance has changed dramatically since this project was first proposed, as Indu said, last September, not even a year ago. And I think it's incumbent on everybody who studies these topics to incorporate that change into our analysis, to try to make sense of it, to figure out the scenarios for how that ripples through the U.S.-Japan relationship. To be clear, I don't mean to say everything has changed. Again, as Indu said, there's a lot that has remained. Core elements of the alliance are stable, but it is worth stepping back, doing the exercise of a basic inventory gut check on what has and hasn't been altered, to test our assumptions about America's views of alliances, and to determine what remains on firm ground and what may perhaps have been, to invoke the noted geopolitical strategist from Coldplay, built on pillars of salt, pillars of sand. Colonel Holman writes in the introduction of his insightful paper, writes in his insightful paper, and I'm quoting, "The U.S. and Japan both understand the incredible strength that comes from a tight-knit coalition of ironclad alliances and partnerships, the members of which all share common aspirations and challenges. Regarding shared aspirations, all are staunch proponents of the rules-based international order, which has contributed to peace and security for the majority of the globe since the conclusion of World War II." So I would very much like to believe that that is all still true, and as Indu said, there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic that it is, and I'm sure that for many American stewards of the alliance, that is still true. But I am not sure that it is for the current administration that is now setting the terms of the alliance. What Professor Sato in his paper calls the gap between the seasoned defense bureaucrats on one hand and President Trump and his political appointees on the other. So for the first time in a very long time, in conversations such as these, statements that had been treated as obvious, as axiomatic, might need to be dissected to consider whether these concepts really still hold. And if they don't, what are the implications? So there are many passages in the three papers that we'll be talking about today that touch on these themes. And I want to use my privileged position as a keynote speaker to help sort of set the frame for the morning, to highlight some of these passages just to encourage that they be given sufficient weight in the conversation, in addition to the obviously important discussions as well about the Chinese threat matrix and how we respond to that. Professor Hinata Yamaguchi warns of gaps in visions and priorities that could inevitably disrupt and obscure Japan's defense planning. Professor Sato's paper presciently has a title that mentions not just growing coordination between the U.S. and Japan, but also the hurdles ahead. He warns of new American positions that have the potential to hurt the very foundations of the bilateral alliance, such as what he calls the Trump administration's offshore balancing leaning, as well as a narrative, this is a quote, a narrative that U.S. troops are stationed in Japan for a sole purpose of defending Japan, end quote. I would like to add another significant unique hallmark of this administration's diplomatic strategy, which is the extreme unpredictability and inconsistency in alliance management. Unpredictability is, of course, often an aspect of international relations. Democracies are messy, leaders can be incompetent, crises erupt. But in this case, the unpredictability often seems to be the point, to keep foreign governments, friends and foes alike, guessing where American policy is heading as a kind of negotiating tactic. And that is, to put it mildly, a rather unconventional strategy for fostering trust among allies. So I want to pause here just to be clear. I am in no way attempting to turn this into a political conversation, nor to take sides in the American political debate. I make no judgment here as to the pros or cons of this new direction. I am observing and encouraging everyone to do the same, that there is a new direction, an earthquake shaking the foundations of post-war American foreign policy and alliances. What had long been seen as a bipartisan consensus is now collapsing in real time. And our analyses of the U.S. Japan alliance need to incorporate that. This shouldn't come as a complete surprise. President Trump has long telescoped his disdain for the bipartisan post-war consensus on American global engagement, and the appointees that he has brought into his cabinet in his second term reflect that same skepticism. But there is something that I do consider shocking about the past 7 months, which is just how easy it has been for President Trump and his team to carry out this transformational agenda. It's worth reflecting a bit on why that has been the case. I wouldn't say that Trump foreign policy is wildly popular with Americans. If you polled voters on whether they actively support these changes or would have wanted them implemented, I doubt majorities would approve. I doubt the ideas would even poll well among those who voted for Mr. Trump last November. On the other hand, there is no sign that his disruptive foreign policy is wildly unpopular either. The hard lesson that we've learned in 2025 is that the elite bipartisan consensus that has defined America's role in the world for much of the past 80 years, including alliances with countries such as Japan, that concept has very little grassroots support. You know, I'm sorry, it looks like I may have blocked the camera on this. Oh, I see. Let's see. Sorry about that. Juggling the, okay, there you go. That concept has very little grassroots support. It's remarkable how quiescent and compliant Congress has been in the face of this dismantling, even the supposed internationalists in the Republican Party. Nor have their constituents risen up to defend the old world order. Now, that may change over time if the real-world consequences of the Trump revolution prove to be damaging to voters in concrete ways. But so far, at least, the concepts of alliances, of American global engagement, of the projection of American soft power have registered very little discernible defense among the broader American public. So tying this back to today's topic, what are the implications of that for the U.S.-Japan alliance and the agenda of strengthening defense and security in the Indo-Pacific? As I said at the outset, I'm no expert and I don't have answers. But I do have questions. As a former journalist, I always have questions that I'd like to raise and encourage for discussion today and beyond. So I will conclude my remarks by listing 4 general questions I consider relevant to today's topic. First, and I think I was talking about this a little bit earlier with Professor Ellis, an early test of the alliance in the alliance's future in the age of Trump will be the next round of negotiations over the status of forces agreement coming up next year. The President and his aides have made clear that they do not consider sufficient the sharp increase in defense spending pledged by former Prime Minister Kishida. For their part, Japanese officials say they've gone about as far as they can go. Is this standard negotiating rhetoric, or does this presage a sharp break in the alliance? Second question, while our focus today is largely on the military aspects of the alliance, that doesn't exist in a vacuum. Joint strategic interests have been served in the region, not just by hard power, but soft power. How is the former affected by the sharp American retreat from the latter, ranging from the termination of Voice of America and Radio Free Asia to the withdrawal of American foreign aid and the unilateral repudiation of the rules-based international order, at least when it comes to trade and investment? A third question, given the continued constraints, as we mentioned earlier, on Japan's use of military force, how will that play with MAGA if American troops based in Japan end up fighting a conflict in the region while Japanese troops limit themselves to rearguard support? What does that backlash look like? And then lastly, what is Japan's breaking point? And if it hits that point, what is Japan's plan B? That is, what is the alternative to the American alliance? I'll mention 3 potential scenarios and eager to hear if anybody has others. A, the most obvious is Japan's hedging middle power strategy already underway, whether it's the landmark deal that Tokyo reached earlier this month to build warships with Australia, or the pursuit of a mega trade deal between the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the European Union. A second scenario becomes relevant if Japan feels uncertain about the reliability of the American nuclear umbrella. If so, we can expect to see in Japan, as Professor Hinata Yamaguchi puts it, the discussion of indigenous nuclear armament. Lastly, and I know this sounds extreme, but I don't think that we can rule out a rapprochement with China. It's not Japan's first choice for all the reasons covered in the impressive research conducted under this project. But the irony is that if the U.S. proves an unstable ally, that may end up being Japan's best, most predictable alternative to ensure its own defense and security in the Indo-Pacific. Not a bolstering of the U.S.-Japan alliance, but its demise. To be clear, I am by no means predicting that, just saying that it may need to be considered as one potential scenario, as one paradigm of American foreign policy collapses and a new one takes shape. So I will stop there and turn it back over to Dr. Saxena. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. That's wonderful. For the wonderful remarks, thank you.
I think if you want them to hear,
Okay,
you have to use that.
sure. Thank you, Jake. Those are wonderful remarks. I just want to add that you rightly pointed out that rapprochement to China, because already India is that's adversary how the border disputes reached to the China. Recently, at the foreign minister level, they had the meeting. Even the Australia prime minister visited last month. And I guess the one more point that we need to think that the regionalism is maybe will be the next moment. So like Japan and Korea, they have been meeting today, their leaders. What will be the next for the in the U.S. foreign policy that will learn more as we deep dive in this conversation. Now, the next speaker, I would like to introduce for the special remarks, Dr. Muhammad Ali. I would like to take the opportunity to introduce Dr. Ali. Dr. Muhammad Ali is the Provost and Chief Learning Officer for Space Force Delta 13 at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. He is responsible for providing oversight for all academic programs for the U.S. Space Force, including curriculum, faculty affairs, institutional effectiveness, accreditations, and scholarship and research. Dr. Ali has nearly 3 decades of federal service and has extensive experience in academic leadership, project management, and public history. Following 7 years overseeing partnership with the University of Massachusetts and the National Park Service, he served with the State Department in Iraq and for 4 years, where he oversaw the direct management of several funding programs totaling over $200 million, which targeted the rebuilding of the nation's civic, educational, and cultural infrastructure. Subsequently, he was posted to a provincial reconstruction team in eastern Afghanistan for USAID, working on major development projects. Prior to joining Delta 13, he supervised several work groups for Air University, including Air University Library, the Teaching and Learning Center, the Registrar's Office, Air University Press, the Office of Sponsored Programs, and the AU Innovation and Accelerator Program. Dr. Ali also served for 6 years in the enlisted ranks of the United States Marine Corps with the 1st Combat Engineer Battalion and Marines Barracks, Hawaii. Welcome, Dr. Ali. Over to you, please.
Thanks. I really did all that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, thank you, everyone. Great to be here in such esteemed company, and thanks again for Dr. Saxena's coordination of this event. So I know we're a little bit behind schedule, so I'm going to really use my Massachusetts motor mouth and help propel the agenda forward. So I'm going to talk briefly about what's going on in the space realm. Really just in this last decade or so, I think strategic planners have realized the ultimate importance of space. No matter, and this is no slight to our friends from Army War College, Naval War College, et cetera, you can have the greatest Army, you can have the biggest Navy. If we do not have eyes in the sky from space, it's going to be very tough to win that next conflict. So this is why leadership has decided to break out and have the Space Force, which was created in 2019. The only other nation to have a fully separate Space Force is China. So the Pacific is front and center on this battle. So What's Japan's involvement in collaborating in space? Is it just there's a long list of activities the nation has been undertaking. I'll just tell a few here. So Japan was one of the original signatories to the Artemis Accords in October 2020. This is to combine I think 56 nations now that have signed on to join together to do the next round of lunar exploration. And Japan has a significant commitment so far, and they're going to be the primary lead for setting up a pressurized land rover. And with that comes the distinct honor of that the commitment of the Artemis Accords that Japan will have the next astronaut on the moon. And we have not been on the moon since December of '72, so it's been a while. And so that's happening. And of course, there's lots of commercial and civic and civil investment in space that Japan's been doing. What's Japan been doing for space defense? Well, you know, as related earlier, there's a substantive growth in defense. There's a commitment, which I think is going to be achieved relatively soon, of spending about 2% of Japan's GDP on defense. With that, though, there are a lot of applications over and above that 2% with investments in dual capacity space investment, meaning, you know, satellites that can take care of you know, civilian purposes as well as military. In 2022, Japan stood up the Japan Air Self-Defense Force Space Operations Group, and that was stood up at Fuchu Air Base. Last month, the Ministry of Defense issued their space domain defense guidelines. It's a strategic plan for defending and protecting the space architecture. And I was talking to our colleague Rio this morning about the soon to occur, maybe next year, maybe in 2027, probable renaming of the Japan Air and Space Self-Defense Force. Again, showing the focus on the importance of this new domain. Again, just highlighting sort of the collaborative efforts between Japan and the United States. There's been joint statements issued the last couple of years with the Japan prime ministers, the last one and the current, and President Biden and President Trump. Those were done in April of last year and more recently February of this year. There's a participation in the continuing dialogues, Japan-U.S. Security Consultative Committee meeting, the 2+2, that happened in January 23. And there's also a continuing comprehensive dialogue on space, which includes you know, commercial as well as military items on the agenda. The last one was held August of last year, and I'm pretty sure there'll be one in the fall. I checked online, I couldn't find any updates on that. And then on the U.S. side, just last December, the Space Force stood up a Space Forces Japan element at Yokota Air Base, and again, illustrating the need for people on the ground working closely with Japan and a partner for defense. Japan and the U.S. have participated collaboratively in wargaming exercises. So last November, they were both doing exercise Keen Sword. Exercise Talisman Saber just finished up a couple weeks ago in early August. And again, space is being integrated in the wargaming exercise because of its inherent joint capabilities. Other issues that Japan and U.S. are working on are the technology for the interoperability, making sure the systems between our two nations communicate easily, make sure that I think we're in a better place, though not perfect, on resiliency for information security systems, so helping Japan get up to speed as we continue to get up to speed on resiliency against hacking into our systems, jamming, et cetera, and a focus on ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. These are the key areas. We all have heard about Golden Dome. This is the new super architecture that will be coming to the fore. Japan is already having conversations with U.S. counterparts on how to have their systems integrate and support ours. So I will close with a quote from Scott Pace, who's the director of Space Policy Institute at George Washington University. And he said recently, "It's not just astronauts and robots that we send into space. It's also our values." And I will say that Japan shares the values that America does to have a peaceful, collaborative space in the cosmos. So thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for your remarks. You rightly said about that the Space Force, now the next domain is the Space Force, and the US has been, US and the allies and partners, they have to look into this, how the China is advancing in its space innovation and research. Thank you, and it's inspiring and insightful. Now we would like to move ahead towards our first panel. I would just like to let you know that one of our panelists will be reaching from in a few minutes, maybe 20 or 30 minutes. So the first panel, Dr. Sato, he's just stranded on at the Montreal airport, but now he will be joining us soon. Happy to know that. Till then, we'll start with Colonel Holman and Royo Yamaguchi. So we'll start the panel that our contributors, they contributed in this with their papers, and I would like to ask our contributors just with when they start, please tell their paper name, title to the audience. So first I would like to invite Colonel Holman. He had joined us from Berlin. Though we started, when the proposal was there, Colonel Holman was here, and I expecting him to see him in person, but maybe the next time. Colonel Jeffrey Holman is the chief. He had served as the Chief Mission Assurance Division, J-34, Headquarters, United States Indo-Pacific Command, Camp H.M. Smith, Hawaii. As the J-34, he had the responsibility for establishing policies and procedures to implement anti-terrorism critical infrastructure project and performance readiness and integration across the Asia-Pacific region, enabling DoD activities to mitigate risks to personnel and resources engaged in full spectrum military operations. Colonel Holman was commissioned in 1995 through the Officers Training School at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. He had completed JPME Phase 1 and 2 and is designated as Joint Qualified Officer. I would like to thank you, Colonel Holman, that he has been with the consortium and supporting our work since the very beginning. Colonel Holman, over to you, please.
All right, thank you, Dr. Indu. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today to this group on my topic, which is U.S. Japan joint response to PRZ gray zone tactics. As mentioned, I'm a retired Air Force officer, and contrary to what Indu said, I'm currently in Stuttgart, Germany, this paper last fall, and as you'd all likely agree, a lot has changed since then, as mentioned by the opening.
You're muted. Just tell him he hit the speak button by accident.
Colonel Holman, you're muted. I guess you pressed the button.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay. As I was saying, I think before I went mute, we have a new U.S. administration that in many ways has shifted the world's focus from traditional geopolitics to trade deficits and tariffs. And this has turned the Indo-Pacific upside down, with allies and partners questioning U.S. commitments and resolve. As we start to hear more and more calls for America first and burden sharing. Many would argue this has opened up a number of opportunities for China, as more nations look to diversify their trade and geopolitical alliances. Since beginning this project, I have, as I said, relocated from the Indo-Pacific to Europe, where I now spend my time working security issues on the African continent. There too, China is finding new opportunities for influence and investment, as the U.S. embraces a policy of trade, not aid. The end result of these distractions, I believe, is a reduction in PRZ gray zone tactics against Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and others. Not because they're ceding ground on territorial issues, but because their attention is elsewhere for the reasons I just described. A notable exception is the recent pursuit of a Philippine Coast Guard vessel by the Chinese Coast Guard, which resulted in the latter colliding with a PLA warship. The incident caught on video by the Philippine Coast Guard underscores the oftentimes aggressive nature of China's gray zone tactics. As advertised in the flyer and mentioned at the outset, my topic is the U.S. Japan joint response to China's gray zone tactics in the Indo-Pacific region. Additionally, my paper analyzes the role of the other two Quad actors, Australia and India. And finally, it explains how the U.S. and Japan's commitment to trilateral BMD, or ballistic missile defense, acts as a very real and effective deterrent to the PRC's gray zone tactics, particularly in the East China Sea, but also extending out across the entire Indo-Pacific. In the paper, I briefly discussed the concept of extended deterrence as it applies to BMD and how it's aimed not only at the DPRK or North Korea, but China as well. And as we know, that extended deterrence primarily focuses on the nuclear arena, but it does extend also into the conventional as well. Regarding gray zone tactics, in its 2022 report on China's use of gray zone tactics, RAND's Project Air Force defined the term as coercive Chinese government geopolitical, economic, military, and cyber and information operations activities beyond regular diplomatic and economic activities and below the use of kinetic military force. It is important to recognize gray zone behavior and call out its perpetrators. 1895. More recently, the PLAN sent its Liaoning aircraft carrier, accompanied by 2 Luoyang 3 class destroyers and 2 Jiangkai 2 class guided missile frigates, to conduct a series of operations in the vicinity of the Senkaku Islands within Japan's EEZ. While passage through a nation's EEZ is allowed under international law, conducting military exercises and maneuvers there can be viewed as provocative and intentional. During the operations, the PLAN strike group conducted approximately 120 takeoffs and landings, demonstrating its ability to dominate the sea space and airspace around the disputed islands. In my paper, I also broached the subject of the possible joint administration of the Senkaku Islands. Some articles that I had read hinted that China may be positioning itself for such a move, and how that would potentially affect Article 5 of the U.S. Japan Mutual Defense Treaty, which would call into question the U.S.'s commitment to defending the outlying islands. I also talk a little bit about the possibility of resuming a bombing range at these largely uninhabited islands, which was done regularly between 1948 and 1977. Use of the bombing ranges was discontinued in 1978 to appease China during its bilateral treaty negotiations with Japan. Additionally, there are a number of exercises that the U.S. and Japan engage in, both bilaterally and with other allies and partners, which serves to provide a deterrence and a response to PRC's raison tactics. The first that I'll talk about briefly is Japan's Iron Fist exercise, which in 2023 exercised counter-piracy tactics, techniques, and procedures, as well as search and rescue operations and mass casualty evacuation scenario. Oriented to improve response to any disaster or crisis, the series has continued to hone amphibious assault operations, acting as a deterrent to anyone seeking to upset the rules-based international order or infringe on another sovereignty. Iron Fist 2024 further focused those skills to exercise recapturing and defending an island. Units from Japan's 2nd Amphibious Rapid Deployment Regiment and tank landing ship J Joint Staff Kunisaki integrated with the Marine Corps' Combat Logistics Battalion 31, Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 121, U.S. Navy Amphibious Squadron 11, and Amphibious Transport Dock USS Green Bay for 3 action-packed weeks. The drills took place on Kyushu and Okinawa and involved over 2,100 personnel. This year's Iron Fist 25 continued the tradition and highlighted the importance of aviation and logistics support to amphibious operations. So you can see with the evolution of this exercise over the last couple of years, our two nations have been really focusing on those skills necessary for providing security in the East China Sea and in particular the Senkaku Islands and Okinawa. Another exercise that we'll talk about briefly is Yamasakura, which Japan invited Australia to join the U.S. in 2023. This annual command post exercise allows participants to plan and assess large-scale combat operations. The 2023 inaugural event brought together 230 members of the Australian Army, 1,500 U.S. Army soldiers, and more than 4,500 Japanese military personnel. 2024 also marked the year Australia joined the U.S. and Japan in exercises Keen Edge and Keen Sword, 2 other large-scale command post training events aimed at improving security cooperation and regional stability. So that's the U.S. and Japan, and also bringing in Australia. We've got other partners that Japan is looking to bring into the fold as well. In May of this year, India and Japan's defense ministers met in New Delhi to discuss opportunities to expand the India-Japan Special Strategic and Global Partnership. The discussions covered a wide range of defense cooperation topics, from counterterrorism and exercises and training to defense industry collaboration for tank and aircraft engines, automation, artificial intelligence, cyber, and space. The sixth iteration of exercise Dharma Guardian involved approximately 250 personnel from India's Madras Regiment and the Japan's 34th Infantry Regiment. Regarding the enhancement of ISR capabilities or intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, in 2023, Japan received its third and final RQ-4 Bravo Global Hawk high-altitude, long-endurance unmanned aerial vehicle. Later that year, the U.S. Air Force relocated a squadron of Global Hawks from Guam to Yokota Air Base. So these two moves in particular are seen as very strategic, and without ISR, as mentioned in the beginning by our space expert, you're really fighting in the dark. On the subject of military technology cooperation, one such mechanism that is being used by the U.S. in Japan is the AUKUS Pillar 2 initiative. So as many of you know, AUKUS is a security partnership between the U.S., the U.K., and Australia. And while Pillar 1 is reserved for the three partners, Pillar 2 intends to invite participation by select nations who share the group's vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. Japan is an obvious choice given its long-standing defense relationship with the U.S. and its reciprocal access agreements with the U.K. and Australia. Japan is not only a like-minded partner, but according to Austin Wu of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, it is also a very technologically capable partner, ranking in the top 5 as a research leader in 8 of 64 key technology areas. In this technology race, 4 heads are better than 1, and the AUKUS 2 pillar partners will need all the advantage they can muster, because China is the world leader in 57 of those 64 critical technology fields. Aside from the various aforementioned bilateral and multilateral exercises, these 4 nations are connected by another special cooperation mechanism called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad. India seems to be particularly sensitive to this possible repercussion due to its ties to both China and Russia through the BRICS coalition. And Japan seems keen to this sensitivity and hesitation on India's part, and recently emphasized India's key role in the survival of the Quad going forward. As of February of this year, at a meeting of the Observer Research Foundation, Japanese envoy to India stated, "Without India, Quad cannot exist. In my personal view, Quad is for India in a sense. There are very big benefits to India, and also engagement with India in Quad is a benefit to us." India has always been the wild card in the Quad's relevance and geopolitical value. And time will tell if it gains or loses momentum, or even if it survives at all. In conclusion, regarding the U.S.-Japan joint responses to PRZ gray zone behavior, I can say that the effectiveness of these responses vary depending on the foundation of the rules-based international order. Publicizing bad behavior, increasing interoperability through bilateral and multilateral exercises, and promoting groupings like Quad and AUKUS are all important and necessary steps to keep the PRC in check. But the ultimate response lies in collective defense from conventional and nuclear attack. As mentioned at the outset, the U.S.-Japan commitment, along with South Korea, to trilateral ballistic missile defense provides a very real and effective deterrent not only to North Korea, but also to the PRC's gray zone tactics. But deterrence is a very complex concept, especially when it comes to assessing the influence on PRC behavior. PRC reactions range from ignoring the response altogether to downplaying the response in the media. Certainly, the PRC is closely watching the development of trilateral BND capabilities by the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. Such capabilities provide a credible defense and escalation control mechanism while moderating overwhelming PRC advantages of long-range strike, both conventional and nuclear. Strong determined cooperation by the U.S., Japan, South Korea, Australia, and India through a variety of exercises, initiatives, and alliances gives the PRC pause when considering how to pursue its national agenda. Though its abandonment of gray zone tactics is highly unlikely, perhaps it will make more transparent diplomatic efforts more attractive and ultimately successful. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present this material, and I look forward to any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Hallman, for your remarks. And I read your paper, and then at one place you mentioned about the response fatigue. So we will take the Q&A session after a while for the observation and comments and some questions. Thank you for your presentation. Now, our next speaker is Ryo Hinata Yamaguchi. I would like to introduce him. He's an associate professor at Tokyo International University, Institute for International Strategy, adjunct senior fellow at the Pacific Forum, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Indo-Pacific Security Initiative in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Ryo has presented, published, and consulted on a variety of topics relating to defense and security and transport governance in the Indo-Pacific. Ryo previously served as a non-commissioned officer in the Japan Ground Self-Defense Forces Reserve and also held position at the Busan National University, University of Memedaya Malang, FM Bird Entertainment Agency, International Crisis Group, Seoul Office, and Saskawa Peace Foundation, Embassy of Japan in Australia, and the Japan Foundation, Sydney Language Center. Ryo received his PhD from the University of New South Wales, MA in Strategic and Defense Studies, and BA in Security Analysis from the Australian National University, and was also a Korean Foundation Language Training Fellow. I welcome Ryo here. Ryo, over to you, please. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much and good morning. So first, I'd like to thank the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers and the U.S. Japan Foundation for this fantastic opportunity. So I just arrived in D.C. late last night after some rough rides with a particular airline, but I'm glad I was here, and I'm hoping that Professor Sato will make it soon as well. So my paper's on Japan's defense planning, and which I see as one of the key aspects of the alliance between the United States and Japan. And in my research, I focus on defense plans and operations mainly. And on top of the gigs I do that, Dr. Saxena talked about, I also work closely with the Japan Self-Defense Force, particularly at the Joint Staff College and the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force Command and Staff College. And I do a lot of work, again, in terms of defense plans and operations. And so in terms of writing about this topic and talking about this topic, I'm sort of working with a moving target, given the various developments going on, and there's a lot going on right now. And it's hard to go over everything, but I'll just go over the basics, and I'm happy to sort of argue more in the Q&A discussions. So in the interest of time, I'll also be hustling through the parts on sort of threats, and the early discussions have talked about these already, but we do see increasing threats and other concerns coming from China and North Korea, not just in terms of military modernization that is going on there, but also the levels of coordination that we are seeing by China and North Korea with Russia. And as some of you may have seen, North Korea just released a video about late last night, and I was welcomed by that, despite the jet lag, of Kim Jong-un congratulating the North Korean soldiers who have participated in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so we do, and so what I'm looking at there is, I don't really see North Korea trying to defend Russia. What I'm saying is North Korea trying to make Russia owe to North Korea. And we are likely to see a lot more military technology transfers from Russia to North Korea, although we don't exactly know what they are. So we do see a lot of developments, increasing threats, and also coordination amongst the threats. And we, in terms of situations, we see increased gray zone situations surrounding Japan and other parts of the Indo-Pacific, as Colonel Holman talked about, and also changes in the means of hybrid warfare. Gray zone situations are not hot conflicts, but they are still clear signs that deterrence has failed, or is at least failing, and these are leading to sustained high-level tensions in almost all domains that raise the likelihood of hot conflicts. The risks of armed conflict are much higher, and we always talk about how the situation is worse than ever, and then every Japanese defense white paper talks about that. And in some ways, it's the usual rhetoric, but it's also not an exaggeration. And so we not just concerned, when someone tells me about when someone asks me about whether China or North Korea is going to attack Japan intentionally in a planned way tomorrow, I'm not going to be so worried about that. However, given the gray zone situations, I am worried about unintended clashes that come from gray zone situations. That is one that I'm worried about, whether it be in East China Sea or elsewhere. We also need to be aware about changes in warfare. Technologies, operations, and tactics have changed dramatically. And if we combine all these together, and I do a lot of wargaming in my work, we are now becoming more aware about simultaneous threats, simultaneous escalation, and also together they make up simultaneous tensions and potentially a simultaneous contingency. Given the interconnected nature of the conflicts and tensions and hotspots in the Indo-Pacific, in particular we can think about a possible simultaneous contingency in Taiwan Strait and the Korean Peninsula, if the situations there get unstable, and we are most likely going to see something in the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea, given the connections there. So there are a lot of war games going on right now. In terms of simultaneous contingencies, a lot of them tabletop exercises, but this has become an increasing area of debate. Now moving on to Japan, Japan is going through a new chapter in its defense planning. As many of you know, in December 2022, the then Kishida administration issued a national security strategy, national defense strategy, and defense build-up plan. Some have said that these are just change in titles, but if you look at the content, they do realistically identify the threats and vulnerabilities that Japan faces, and it significantly shaped Japan's strategies and readiness for warfighting, which is a very new phase in Japan's defense planning if you look at the history of Japan's defense planning since the establishment of the self-defense force. It also mentions the connections and the coordination, also the need for greater connection and coordination between defense, law enforcement, and intelligence organs, which have been, where there were very serious gaps for many, many years. And he also outlined a lot of the things that Japan needs in terms of capabilities, which are standoff defense capabilities, integrated air and missile defense, unmanned defense capabilities, in the air, above water, and also underwater, so unsea. C2 and intelligence-related functions, mobile deployment capabilities and civil protection, sustainability and resiliency, and also, of course, cross-domain operations. So we see like a lot going on. In the past, Japan has focused on particular capabilities such as missile defense, submarine warfare, anti-submarine warfare, mine warfare, cyber, electronic, amphibious, and blah, blah, blah. But we're now bringing them together to try and sort of execute them in a seamless manner. And the key thing that is going on right now in this regard is joint operations, and this has been significantly enhanced with the session of the Joint Operations Command earlier this year. So there are a lot of developments, but there are also still a lot of outstanding shortages. One is persisting vulnerabilities. As I've mentioned in the paper, there are still shortages of readiness to deter and defend against the fast and growing and multi-faceted threats. And also that Japan is inherently vulnerable given that it is located within China's A2AD. There are also dilemmas in boosting defense readiness. The balance between full structure and operational readiness. This is a problem that every country is going to face, but Japan faces this a lot in terms of not only shortage of capital, but also in terms of financial capital, but also human capital. Demographic issues are getting in the way, and also Japan also has its fair issues, a lot of other problems in terms of recruitment and retention. There's also a bandwidth problem that Japan has to deal with many other problems in its nation alongside defense, and how to get all of those done is going to be quite a challenge. And even regarding the alliance with the United States, indeed there are a lot of sort of pessimistic and skeptical opinions and some questions, given some of the political developments in both countries. But I think it's also important not to overlook the progress that we have made so far, particularly in the last decade and a half. We do see quite a lot more coordination, and we see a lot more combined operations going on. Exercises are a lot better. They're more practical and lethal, as opposed to some of the more ceremonial procedural ones that we did in much earlier years. And I can say for myself that a lot of the exercises are deeper and they're more expanded. Interoperability has also improved. Not perfect, but again, a lot better than before. That said, there are still a lot of strategic ambiguities. There was an article in the Financial Times several weeks ago citing some of the remarks made by officials here in the United States. But then my close colleague Zach Cooper was saying that, okay, well, if the United States tells Japan to sort of show its stance and be clear on what it's going to do in the case of Taiwan contingency, well, it's going to be hard to convince Japan to do that when the U.S. itself is ambiguous about its position, right? And I think that's a very valid remark. And we see that in other theaters as well. We also have budget issues. Okay? I know there are great demands for Japan to increase its defense budget, but that's not going to be easy, given Japan's economic situation right now. And also, to increase the defense budget at that rate is not going to be, it's an uphill struggle for a country that tends to be more status quo. And also, of course, we have issues regarding SOFA. So there's a whole number of things out there that we need to solve, but again, I also want to make clear that we have made a lot of progress if we compare the state of the alliance to the years of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Going back to Japan's defense plans very quickly before I wrap up, there are many things going on right now. So we will, the Japan's 5-year defense plan, or the National Defense Strategy and Defense Build-Up Plan, that's being accelerated. That's being accelerated. We're seeing a lot of new acquisitions coming online over next year. Drones, various other capabilities relating to joint operations, and also just to sort of put the cherry on top, the Japan Air Self-Defense Force will become the Japan Air and Space Self-Defense Force, and so forth. And so there's a lot of good things going on in Japan and also with the United States. Some people talked about, okay, well, what happens if the Japan-US alliance goes into great uncertainty? Yes, there are a lot of people talking about, the what ifs and so forth, but at least from the Japanese side, a lot of people are saying that because they want the U.S.-Japan alliance to stay, right? Options, rapprochement with China, well, okay, it's not impossible, but it's also not ideal, and there are natural limits. Japan, Korea, again, they are getting closer to try and keep the Japan, U.S., Korea triangle together, right? And it's likewise for Australia. The nuclear option, okay, yes, I do hear this every now and then, but this hasn't really moved forward that much in terms of strategy, policy, and operations at all. People are talking about it, but it's not the first thing that people talk about in meetings. However, we are hearing a lot about some nuclear strategies, but again, this is in context of the alliance of the United States. So just to wrap up, again, because I know we're so pressing for time, but there are perhaps more steps that we need to still take, between U.S. and Japan going forward. Readiness against complex threats and situations. We need sharper and stronger strategies and readiness. This is going to be hard when there's so much ambiguity in between us, yes, but we do hear a lot of valid questions being raised, and I think that's a start. Capacity and readiness. Again, interoperability is everything in terms of coordination at the operational level. There are improvements, but I think we can still do more, not just through exercise and drills, but also having staff from the U.S. forces coming over to Japan and vice versa. I think we can do a lot more of that. So interoperability, but also interchangeability in terms of being able to use one another's kits. And so, when we talk about the U.S.-Japan alliance, it's not just about making our capabilities stronger, but also about filling gaps and vulnerabilities. And so there are essentially more questions than answers, but I think that in itself is a roadmap. Okay. Finally, multilateral security network, security dialogues and exercises, with other allies and like-minded states, Australia, South Korea, particular, but also the Philippines. I think it's another country that we can think about. And although there may be some caveats here, we do have a lot of good partners in South Asia, particularly India. But one other place that I do think that the U.S. and Japan needs to think more about, okay, even though we may not be able to do some real military exercise or some coordination with them, are the South Pacific Islands. Okay, I think that's a region that we cannot ignore. It's a region that Japan, U.S., and Australia can do a lot more on. Institutionalizing cooperation, coordination, communication ain't easy, and it pivots on the 5 C's: clarity, compatibility, consistency, credibility, and capacity. Again, I know I'm talking a lot here about all the things that we should do, blah 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 blah. But I think these are some of the things that we can work on going forward. So again, I thank the consortium of Indo-Pacific researchers, particularly Dr. Saxena, and the U.S. Japan Foundation, and I look forward to working with all of you going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Royo, for your insightful remarks. And as we have been waiting for the Professor Sato to reach here, please allow me to open the session for the QA. And using my prerogative rights, I would start asking the question. My question is to the Colonel Holman. And Colonel Holman, you mentioned the joint response fatigue challenge to the alliance. Could you please elaborate this, and what is the implication for this to the Indo-Pacific and the contingency itself?
Thank you for that question. So certainly, prior to this new administration, fatigue was an issue, just based on the frequency and aggressiveness of China's gray zone tactics, pretty much targeting everybody in the Indo-Pacific, but primarily, Philippines, Australia, Japan in particular. And it's tough enough when you have an ironclad alliance like we've had historically with Japan. But when that starts to falter, that fatigue kind of takes on a new level of toll on the countries that are in the crosshairs. So really, we've just got to continue to look for ways to mitigate and combat that gray zone activity. Publicizing it, getting out there in the media, and making sure it doesn't go unanswered is really the best way to keep it on the forefront. Most people would look at China's activities, their gray zone activities. And I think most reasonable people would look at it and think, that's not reasonable what China is doing. They're claiming the 9-dash line and everything in it. We have the arbitration, which has said, no, that is not valid, but yet China says, we don't care, we're going to continue to claim the entirety of the South China Sea and much of the rest of the Indo-Pacific. So I think Japan is going to be well served to continue to look for strengthen other alliances besides the U.S. alliance. So we mentioned, I mentioned in my paper, and others have mentioned their outreaches to not only Australia, but also India and the Philippines, offering to provide support and equipment. We're also seeing them dial up their involvement in Africa as well. So I think they're just trying to spread their chips around the board a little bit and not keep all their eggs in one basket, hoping that this stressful time, with the current administration will soon pass. Thanks.
Thank you, Colonel Holman. And I have the last question for the Royo. Royo, how do you see that? Curious to know that what will be the immediate impact if the U.S. forces Korea scale back, the U.S. administration scales back the U.S. forces Korea. Why I am saying this to you, because as you have the experience in the defense planning, and then secondly, because the Korean president is coming to Washington next week, and if the trade talks doesn't go well, maybe there is some kind of pressure. So how do you see that? What will be the impact on the region?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Maybe go up to the right.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you, Dufat. Great question. So regarding trade, I'm not going to. I can't really talk too much about that. Problems with my own finances, so I don't know how all that stuff works. But regarding USFK, and being a person that has worked on Korean affairs and has lived in Korea for about nearly 10 years now, I can say that this is one of the most sensitive issues that I've heard being conversed in the last few months, and years, in fact. The USFK, the so-called USFK problem is causing a number of issues, not only in South Korea, but also its alliance with the United States and also here in Japan for a number of reasons. One is the fact that these are the kinds of conversations that are driving some uncertainties in South Korea and leading to the discussion about indigenous nuclear armament in South Korea. That's one. And two, it's also going to, in some ways, encourage North Korea and China to sort of push a resolve. And number three, this is also going to undermine, in many ways, the trilateral coordination between U.S., Japan, and South Korea, in the way that, well, do we have the readiness in the right place? Draw down, reducing the number of personnel and capabilities in USFK, or even using some of that for Taiwan contingency, personally, I'd see it as unwise in some ways, because we are going to essentially be weakening our deterrence against a North Korean threat that is far stronger than what it was back in 2018 when these kinds of discussions first emerged. That's one problem. Second one is that although I believe in the U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral coordination, this does not mean that we have to sort of clump together as like some kind of triad that deals with every threat in the Indo-Pacific. Rather, I think I see it as a division of labor, okay, where U.S. and South Korea primarily focus on the Korean Peninsula, okay, and U.S. Japan primarily focus on East China Sea and Taiwan Strait. Okay, yes, you might need to sort of cross on these over, but that should only be done when it's really needed. Okay. Again, I talked about simultaneous contingencies earlier, and what we found is that immediately there will be limitations in capacity. Okay. And that can't be dealt with by just mixing everything together, but rather by having clear coordination and also sufficient readiness in both the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan Strait. So it's a complex problem, but again, this whole USFK issue, I think is going to raise a lot more problems than opportunities, in the U.S.-Japan, U.S.-South Korea alliance, and also the Indo-Pacific overall. Yeah. So hopefully that was enough. Thanks.
Now, moving ahead, before I invite Professor Dombrowski for his observation and comments, I want the audience to for the questions. And I see Professor Sato is here, so glad to see you. So let me invite him for his presentation, if you are okay, or if you are comfortable. So, okay, sure. Come on, guys. I'm happy to see you here, and I would like to introduce you. Professor Yoshiro Sato, he's currently teaching at Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University, and is a professor at the Department and the Graduate School of Asia Pacific Studies. Recently, he was also a visiting senior research fellow at Yusof Ishak Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. His major works include Re-Rising Japan, co-edited book in 2017, Handbook of Indo-Pacific Studies, and Alliances in Asia and Europe, the Evolving Indo-Pacific Strategic Context and Inter-Regional Alignments. He holds a BA from Keio University, MA in International Studies from the University of South Carolina, and PhD Political Science from the University of Hawaii. Welcome, Professor Sato. Over to you. Yeah, I would like to, yes, please.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for a kind invitation and nice introduction for me. And I apologize about my delay in arriving at DC. I had some issue with the transit at Toronto airport and ended up staying overnight at the airport. So anyway, today I'm to talk about key aspects of the evolution of the U.S.-Japan alliance. But if you really want to go deep into that subject, it's gonna, spend the whole day. So I think I will really skip the early part of the evolutions and just focus on some of the key aspects of it. And I think the first aspect of the alliance evolution is the increasing mutuality between Japan and the United States. The alliance no doubt started as a kind of one-sided and asymmetrical arrangement between Japan and the US. The first treaty didn't spell out the US responsibility to defend Japan, while it did spell out Japan's obligation to offer bases for the American troops. And this kind of asymmetric arrangement was over time rectified, and in the 1960 revised treaty, the US obligation to defend Japan was explicitly stated, whereas Japan continued to provide bases for the US troops. But the scope of the alliance was still asymmetrical in the sense that Japan was not expected to do very much, even for the defense of its own territory. And Japan, under the so-called Yoshida Doctrine, focused on rebuilding its economy. But from about the time of the Nixon administration in the United States, the burden sharing demand from the United States became more vocal, and Japan was gradually expected to play more of its own security role. And the first U.S. Japan defense guideline spelled out clearly that Japan is primarily responsible for the defense of its own territory, and more specifically, the discussion about the hypothetical defense of Hokkaido against the invading Soviet troops was discussed, and Japanese ground forces was supposed to hold the territory at least for 3 days until the Americans arrived to the rescue. So that doesn't sound like too much of its own defense, but that was the beginning of the movement toward more mutuality. Just skipping everything in between, I want to talk about the increasing mutuality in the sense of Japan's the proactive contributions to the collective defense through reinterpretation of the Constitution under the Abe administration in 2014-2015 period, and a series of security-related legislation at the time enhanced the bilateral defense cooperation. Plus, I added plus because the collective defense was explicitly acknowledged as constitutional, and the partner was not only the United States, but it was defined as a country whose security is critically important for Japan's own security. So the new interpretation opened the door for collective defense cooperation with countries like Australia, UK, and other like-minded and capable states. So that was a major progress in terms of enhancing mutuality of the alliance. The second point about this increasing mutuality is Japan's roles in regional contingencies beyond Japan's own territorial defense. This didn't start with 2015, rather it will go back to the late 1990s when Japan passed the regional contingency law in anticipation of a possible conflict over the Korean Peninsula or over the Taiwan Strait. The guideline for U.S. Japan defense cooperation was revised at the time, and then another revision also took place more recently. Through those revisions, regional contingency responses and Japan's role within such contingencies was more actively discussed between the two governments. The second point of evolution is the U.S. tilt toward offshore balancing. This is an unfortunate trend, but it has a major dilemma for the United States. The bilateral security arrangement was heavily based on the U.S. Forward deployment of troops on the bases in Japan. But those bases have become more vulnerable to the growing missile threats coming from North Korea and China. And the way Japan and the US initially responded to this growing threat was through the development of the Missile Defense Corporation. But this approach has an inherent limitation because shooting down missiles, incoming missiles, especially with Japan's very strict restrictions against the first strike against the enemy missile bases, is purely not economical compared to a deterrence approach through deploying Japan's own or the US own missiles on the Japanese territory. So in order to cope with this difficulty, the US is basically pursuing two things. One is to pull back, move the forward deployed troops outside the range of the growing missile threats from North Korea and China. The negative attachment to this approach is that it causes a credibility issue in the bilateral alliance. Without the ground troops on the Japanese territory, Japan feels less secure about the US commitment to defend Japan. So that is the first dilemma. The second thing US is pursuing is to diversify the ground force presence and moving more toward access approach, seeking accesses at more diversified points within the Japanese territory. Again, this didn't start under the 2015 the revisions, but it started in the late 1990s when the regional contingency law was passed by the Japanese parliament. The US and Japan started jointly researching the civilian ports and airfields which could be used for a regional contingency. And this approach possibly opens up the many other facilities than the current US bases throughout Japan. So in such an event, for example, China may launch preemptive strikes against the US bases throughout Japan. The US forces still could be diverted to other facilities throughout Japan, civilian ports and airfields. So that kind of approach is another way the US is coping with this growing missile threat from China and North Korea. But the dilemma with this is the new policy always comes with dilemma, and the dilemma with this is it causes NIMBY issue in Japan. The civilians in the various prefectures, they don't want, they want the alliance with the US, but they don't want the presence within their neighborhood. So that will create a difficult challenge domestically. The third aspect of the evolution of the alliance is actually a negative one, and it is the absence of geostrategic understanding in political level discussion. expertise about the defense issues is pretty much confined to a very narrow circle of people at both sides, on the US side and Japan side, centered around the defense bureaucracy. And the 2+2 talks, which involves the foreign policy, the bureaucracy, again, is not publicly informing the general population or the politicians, most of the politicians, except those few who are interested in such defense issues, which usually don't bring votes for them. Since Donald Trump became the US president, his presidential communication with the public is not helping this problem. Rather, it's making the problem worse. He's been propagating false narratives that the US is defending Japan and US troops are there to defend Japan, ignoring all other aspects of the bilateral alliance, especially the geostrategic advantage for the US to be able to place troops at the front line on the periphery of the Eurasian continent. So, what is to be done? It's very difficult to do anything under the current administration because the defense experts in the United States fully understand all these problems, but they cannot speak out under the current administration. This has more to do with the president's the personality and the management style, which is quite controlling, and unless the political leadership in the United States changes, it is quite likely that the voices of reason in the bilateral alliance management will be suppressed. So, should we just wait until his term is over? I think we shouldn't wait, but we should continue the discussion at the working level, and also we should work on the public diplomacy in both countries. The message is to be enhanced, communicated within the US is that the alliance has increasing mutuality, and Japan's specific roles within this mutuality needs to be clearly communicated with the general public in the United States. The American voters should also be informed about the geostrategic utilities of the forward deployed US troops. They are not there only to defend Japan or other allies. They are there to make sure that the US defense perimeter stays far out of the Californian coast and as close to the Chinese coast and the Eurasian continent, so that the Pacific remains safe for the use by the US Navy. This is a critical advantage of having forward deployed bases in Japan and other places like the Philippines. For the Japanese side, the deterrence intent of the US troops and the bilateral mechanism of prior consultations need to be communicated clearly. The Japanese leftists have, for a long time, propagated in the US a lot of anti-American messages, and this creates a fear that the US may have a offensive intent and use the bases in Japan for that purpose. The Vietnam War time, the US used the bases in Okinawa to launch attacks against the Vietnamese troops, and the leftists were very much opposed to that. And those same people may think that the US intent is to strike China first using the bases in Japan. This kind of false understanding on the Japanese side needs to be corrected so that the base diversification and access issues will proceed without too much of a NIMBY issue on the Japanese side. This is partly happening already. For example, more than a decade ago, I had a chat with a Yomiuri Shimbun journalist whose next assignment was Iwakuni. And it was a time when the Marine Corps was introducing the Osprey planes to Iwakuni. And there was some opposition in Japan, but of course Yomiuri is a conservative newspaper, and Yomiuri journalist agreed with me that the stationing of Osprey in Iwakuni will contribute to a closer U.S.-Japan alliance, and she was willing to, work on on the public opinion in the area. And there was no strong opposition in Iwakuni and Yamaguchi Prefecture to torpedo the deployment. So I can point to many other examples, but that kind of public opinion management on the Japanese side is very important. And finally, I think the US temptation to adopt offshore balancing strategy and delegate the regional stability roles to Japan is going to create new problems, especially the credibility issue and so forth that I mentioned earlier. So instead of just delegating, two countries should work at enhancing the jointness of their working for the purpose of maintaining regional stability against the possible contingency in the Korean Peninsula or Taiwan Straits. This is not easy. In fact, Prime Minister Kishida, when he visited here, Washington, D.C., he was pressured into explicitly committing Japan to the defense cooperation with the United States in the Taiwan Strait contingency, and he basically dodged the question. Yeah. So Japan's not ready, but Japan should not stop the discussion, and maybe this discussion cannot be made public because of the ambiguity which surrounds the Taiwan diplomacy. But that doesn't mean that the discussions at the political level should not move forward. So I should stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sato, for your insightful remarks. And we'll see, because we are, clock is ticking and we are tight in the time. So using our coffee break time here, sorry we are not able to do the break at this time. Please keep having your coffee from the back. And if you have any question from this panel, from the audience, just go ahead, shoot it out, else I will invite Professor Peter Dombrowski for his observation.
Thank you, Indu.
I would like to take the opportunity to introduce you, Peter.
Indu, why don't you let me just give a brief introduction?
Okay, sure, please, go ahead.
Okay, it'll save time for you. My name is Peter Dombrowski. I'm a professor at the Naval War College. In fact, I'm the William B. Ruger Chair of National Security Economics. Although it doesn't appear much on my resume, I have a long relationship with the JMSDF through the Naval War College, including at one point being the liaison between the Maritime Staff College and MSO in the Naval War College. I've played in a number of war games that involve the JMSDF, the joint American-Japanese interests. So it's just a great pleasure to be here. And I'll try to keep my remarks short to save us some time. I do want to thank Indu and the consortium. I do want to say I wish I was at the Cosmos Club, where I've been many times and enjoyed it immensely. But I'm pleased to be able to join you virtually. I have to give a disclaimer in this political environment and also just professionally over the years. I am an employee of the U.S. government. Everything I say in these remarks are my own personal opinions and shouldn't be construed as an official position of the U.S. government, the Naval War College, the U.S. Navy, or the Department of Defense. And I think that's pretty clear, but I want to emphasize that because it allows me slightly more freedom to be honest about my assessment. So I'm going to have 4 general points. I'm going to take a little bit of liberty and address our keynote speaker, Dr. Fletcher's talk about the possibility of some sort of settlement or rapprochement between China and the U.S. And then I'll address the papers of our 3 presenters as well. So I do want to say something about Mr. Fletcher's remarks, because I think it's really important for defense planning and for strategic planning to look into the future, do some scenario planning, and do some futures work and think about what are the possibilities. I don't think any of the people in this audience want there to be a break in the U.S. relationships or expect a rapprochement between China and the U.S., China and Japan on some of the outstanding territorial and sea line and island chain issues. But it's a possibility, and we need to be cognizant of that, and we think through it carefully in all sorts of levels. And I hope that scholars and analysts take this seriously and think through what it might mean both for Japan and for the United States, and more importantly, for the entire Indo-Pacific region. And I will just say, as a general point, this is not a bilateral issue in any way, shape, or form. I'll just say one thing about the United States. Our entire defense structure and national security structure, diplomatic structure in the United States, Japan is a linchpin. It is essential. And if there's some change in status and not of Japanese relations with China, it would have quite an impact on American thinking. So I think it was a great thing to be raised, and I appreciate it. Colonel Holman, thank you. You covered a lot of ground. In fact, you covered something that I'm written about quite a bit, and near and dear to my heart was the issue of military and naval exercises. And you talk about gray zone and hybrid operations, which again is something I don't write often about, but I think a lot about given the context, strategic support to the Navy and the U.S. government. The one thing I want to emphasize, and I think a couple of our later speakers talked about it, is that one of the reasons that gray zone operations and hybrid operations and China's pressure in the South China Sea on all the local partners is that it raises the possibility of escalation. Because the biggest single threat to world peace, much less regional peace, is that there is a great power war or a high-tech war. And pressure operations, bumping ships in the Philippine Sea, all these sorts of things offer the possibility of accident and chance will dramatically raise the stakes and potentially lead to a more serious conflict. So it's important that, not only we think about gray zone operations and exercising these things in and of themselves, it's important that we think about them in terms of escalation management and the prevention of conflict, and think about things like exit ramps and so forth to prevent the worst things from happening. I'm very pressed for time, so I'm going to not do justice to everybody's full remarks. Professor Yamaguchi, again, thank you for your presentation. Like you, I work a lot of defense planning, I do a lot of war gaming, I do a lot of sort of strategic TTXs. I do want to say that there's something we need to think about. It's speculated in the academic literature a bit, but maybe not enough. And this also ties to the remarks by Professor Sato, is that the regional contingencies above and beyond the defense of Japan and Japanese territory become critically important because, quite frankly, it's unclear that the United States can do the sorts of things it wants to do to protect partners and allies without Japan, certainly in terms of the staging area, but also in terms of burden sharing of various other kinds of security operations in the regional contingency, in terms of various kinds of support that Japan would provide to American forces. It's a sensitive subject given Japanese restrictions, even with changes over the last 2 decades. But inside the government, and serious academics need to think very carefully about the kinds of regional contingencies. And that sounds too broad because it's a term of art and means major war, but even smaller conflicts can have this escalatory function, and even smaller conflicts can raise issues for the U.S. Japan alliance, and we need to think about those very carefully. One thing Colonel Hogan also said that I want to touch upon is interoperability. There's something going on based in part on the Ukraine war, based in part on Red Sea operations, that's going to be increasingly critical to the U.S.-Japanese defense alliance, is the proliferation of unmanned systems, uncrewed systems in the battle space, in the strategic space in the region, and how they interact in terms of man-machine interfaces, how they interact with our potential adversaries, but more importantly, just what concepts of operations and coalition are necessary to actually adopt the modern aspects of conflict we're seeing going on in Ukraine and the Red Sea region. And this is, again, an understudied thing. It needs a lot of work. Professor Cato, thank you very much for your tour to Horizon. I want to talk a little bit about something. I read a lot about grand strategy, particularly American grand strategy, but also comparative grand strategy, a number of books, and so forth. I'm going to push back a little bit on your idea that America has adopted an offshore balance. I think perhaps at the macro level that's true, but my colleague and co-author for many books and many articles, Simon Reich and I, are committed to the idea that America a macro sense of U.S. strategy, in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in the Western Pacific, particularly the western littoral, within the first and second island chain, I don't think we have a policy of offshore. I think it's much more forward defense, forward presence, and that brings us to another question, which nobody wants to talk about. I know that. I certainly don't want to talk too much about it, given political times. But the elephant in the room here is China. That's the potential scenario, whether it's blockade, frustrate, coercion, that raises the most stress for Japan-U.S. relations and for U.S. relations with other allies and partners, including the whole spectrum. I'd like you to think about this. I can see I've run out of time, so I'll close my remarks there. Thank you for the invitation, and if there's any question, I'm happy to take. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much. Now, quickly, I would like to invite my colleague, Mr. Chris Kolowski. He's the director of the Wisconsin Museum and the senior fellow at the consortium. Please take your seat with the panel and proceed.
At the end, we'll have some questions, but basically I'm going to let each of them, I'm going to introduce all of them now, and then I'm going to let each of them in succession come up here and offer their thoughts and reflections on what we're discussing today. And then, like I said, at the end, if there's any questions, or we may have time. Otherwise, I know many of us are convening for lunch after this, so we can always have an informal discussion then too. And then I'll do the concluding remarks following all that. So in order here to my right, first of all, is Professor Evan Ellis of the U.S. Army War College, who is a research professor for Latin American Studies. He's done quite a bit of incredible work. If you're not following him on his website or on his email list, you should, because there's some really insightful stuff that he's got. And I will condense his very long biography into simply also say that in addition to the scholarship that he puts out, he's also advised the U.S. State Department and been involved in quite a few policymaking roles as well. So it's wonderful to have his voice. Next will be Ken Moriyasu, who has over 20 years of experience at the financial newspaper Nikkei. Among other things, and I want to ask you about this later, Ken, he was the last person to interview Ariel Sharon before Ariel Sharon died. He's been a correspondent in Tokyo, D.C., Cairo, Beijing, and in China. And then at the end, last but not least, is a friend and colleague of mine, Tim Wilging, who's held a variety of posts in and out of uniform in the U.S. The U.S. Defense Department. He currently works down in Quantico for the Marine Corps. I should emphasize that the same disclaimer that Peter Dombrowski gave also applies to Evan and to Tim. Even though they're federal employees, their opinions today are their own. And so with that, I'm going to get out of the way, and I'm going to let Evan lead us off.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the Indo-Pacific Research Foundation, certainly the U.S. Japan Foundation as well, for the opportunity to share my remarks with you. Just to repeat, of course, the disclaimer, as a civilian employee of the U.S. Army, everything that I'm going to say today is my own personal academic opinion and does not necessarily represent the U.S. government. There's a lot of terrain to cover, so I realize my time is very short, so forgive me if I go very quickly. I remember when I first talked to Dr. Saxena about what I wanted to say today, I was a little bit worried about how it might be interpreted, and so I was actually very glad to hear when Jacob Schlesinger spoke that I found that many of the points that I feel need to be made, frankly, correspond to what he had to say. So first of all, what I see when we think of the Japan-U.S. partnership is that right now, in my personal opinion, China does perceive itself to have increasingly adequate military strength. There are things that have to be addressed with respect to amphibious operations and things like that, and the ability to conduct a cordon operation, but certainly also the perception that the U.S. is increasingly distracted and to a certain extent in questionable relationships with some of its traditional alliances. And really for me, the question for China is whether it's willing to take the risk of what could be a successful cordon or invasion operation of Taiwan. When I look at, it's interesting, there's a poll that suggested that 77% of the Japanese public doubt whether the United States would actually come to its aid in time of a war over the Taiwan contingency, and that for me was striking. But let me go straight to what I believe are what the United States can and needs to do with Japan, as well as its other partners in the Indo-Pacific, to be a stronger ally, to have that credible deterrence. And for me, it's a holistic approach that goes to both global and Indo-Pacific factors. And so global, again, my desire is not to make this a political, but number one, it's imperative as Japan and others look to the United States that elsewhere the U.S. has healthy alliances and partner interactions. I referred to, of course, our interactions with NATO. I referred to our interactions and some of the ways in which we manage other aggressors such as Vladimir Putin and some of those negotiations. I would also refer at a more warfighting level to the need for the U.S. to address some of the issues that would cause the questionability of the sustainability or survival of a force that we deploy in the Indo-Pacific, issues such as munitions, and frankly issues such as some of the other commitments that we could be making, whether we're going to be bogged down in other conflicts. I would mention the current breaking one in Venezuela. And frankly, I think for Japan especially, but others in the Asia-Pacific, given some of the dramatic downsizing of the State Department and certainly the National Security Council staff, and I would point to people like even Kanepathy and losing about half of his staff. I think probably our Japanese and other allies are rightfully concerned about just the level of in-depth knowledge of managing some of these crises. But when we turn to the Indo-Pacific, and let me just very briefly hit 7 points. Number one, I believe that the way in which the U.S. conducts its tough posturing specifically towards Xi Jinping in China, limiting Xi and demonstrating U.S. resolve. And I think especially right now, there are a series of different things with the trade negotiation, which is a very worrisome signal, especially giving China access to NVIDIA and AMD chips in order to get rare earth access, in order to also the desire to extend certain negotiations in terms of the trade escalation, the question of exempting China from secondary sanctions, and certainly in order to get past trade frictions, the very unfortunate, if informal, canceling of the stopover of Taiwanese, leader Tony Lai. I think those probably for Japan, wondering about whether we would make the hard choices in the Indo-Pacific sends a very worrisome message, although I believe it's only partly the case. Obviously, number two is trying to move past some of the tariff fights and tariff issues. My hope is that at least with the current 15% arrangement, that is at least settled for the moment and continues to stay settled. Number three, and this has been referred to already, what I would call the healthy state of multilateral alliances. And we've already talked a great deal, my very esteemed colleagues, but making sure that the Quad continues to be functional, and of course, India is a key part of that. But there are also a number of practical things in terms of, for example, the upcoming Ports of the Future initiative and other things that have already taken place, the logistics network, the Sea Observer mission, et cetera, et cetera. But more than anything, making sure that we find a way that India does not cause, and our relationship with India does not cause the Quad to explode. Number two, of course, the AUKUS alliance, and of course, the very good point about Japan's role in Pillar 2. But it's really also some of the big issues like the Virginia submarine issue with Australia, but also possibilities to build in the future beyond the Virginia submarine in areas like AI and remote sensing. But I think at the end of the day, I see that as another pillar which reinforces the Japanese. When we look, of course, at the Asian alliance structure and the new exercises that we're building around ASEAN, that is promising, and I think we need to take that forward. And then certainly with respect to the Japan relationship, and many of these things going back to the change in the 2022 national security strategy, the defense strategy, the build-up, the very valuable commitment by Japan to increase its defense spending, and really some of the things that continue to tie Japan to the United States, the F-35s, the UAVs, the Tomahawk weapons as counter-strike munitions, et cetera, and perhaps also very importantly, and I believe Mr. Yamaguchi mentioned this, the issue of the transition building on the Japanese Joint Operations Command and moving towards a U.S. forward station Joint Force Headquarters, and so a push forward rather than a pull back. Also, as was mentioned before, the issue of, as we go towards the status of force agreement renegotiations, what I would call more broadly the resolution of frictions that come out of the I think 130 U.S. bases, especially around Okinawa and in other places, the NIMBY problem that the professor so well pointed to. I think there is a useful, and this was mentioned obliquely, but the trilateral relationships, and so the way in which Japan is pulling the U.S. together with the Japan-U.S.-Australia trilat, the Japan-U.S.-India trilat, the Japan-U.S.-UK trilat, et cetera. And again, Mr. Yamaguchi mentioned this, but the importance, especially the Korean trilat, of continuing to anchor the United States and Japan together through these other relationships. I would mention a little bit more briefly, of course, U.S. actions to strengthen the credibility of what I would call a survivable, defended Taiwan. And to me, and again, going back to the gray zone operations, this not only is about U.S. Verbal commitments to defend Taiwan, which I believe Secretary Hegseth has suggested to within the domain of our strategic ambiguity, but also other things such as credible U.S. responses in the domain of cordon operations by the PRC, cyber operations, other gray zone activities in our response. And certainly to that end, the continuity of FONOPS operations, especially FONOPS with our Japanese partners, whether it's in places like Second Thomas Shoals or other places, I think continue to be very important. I won't dwell on the issues that we know so well with the advance of Chinese capabilities, continuing to keep U.S. capabilities and their survival in theater credible, but again, again that's a big block, and in the interest of time, I'll skip over that. But what I also wanted to close on is a point that was made very briefly, but I think we, in our military look, and again, I go back to something that Mr. Schlesinger mentioned, which is the economic dimension of this. To me, it's not just about the military, but it's about essentially preventing a U.S. withdrawal from economic engagement in the region, allowing the PRC through its demand and also through its oftentimes corrupt economic relationships with other actors in the region, whether it's Cambodia or Vietnam or others, to weave a web of influence that ultimately erodes the region's capacity to respond, and essentially leaving Japan and others alone in that fight. And so to the extent to which U.S. economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific, to me, is a vital, if not the core vital part of ensuring that we keep away from the type of war over Taiwan and continue to reassure Japan, not only in military, but in other terms, of our ability to continue to stand steadfast with this vital partnership that we have. So forgive the rapidity of my remarks, but a real honor for me to be part of this group today. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm Ken Moriyasu from Nikkei Asia. I'm going to talk about three things. One, it's not about Trump, focus on J.D. Vance. Two, it's no longer about values, it's interests, and the end of the Kishida foreign policy. And three, in direct response to Mr. Schlesinger's proposal, I absolutely think that Japan has an option of bandwagoning with China rather than going for the nuclear option. So those are the three things I'm going to talk about. First, why focus on J.D. Vance? If you look at the 2024 election, I think the biggest, starkest difference between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump was foreign policy. Kamala Harris offered to defend the liberal hegemony, continuing a global primacist foreign policy. Trump, of course, was very different than that. And as a result, all 7 swing states went to Trump. And I think that's a real rejection of this primacy foreign policy. That is reflected in the National Defense Strategy that is going to come out next week by the end of August, spearheaded by Elbridge Colby. There's going to be 4 pillars of that. One is the focus is on defending the homeland, as you can see by the National Guard in Washington, D.C. 2 is deterring China. 3 is burden sharing with allies. And 4 is revitalizing the national defense industrial base. But the biggest the pillar of the national defense strategy is that America can no longer fight multiple wars at the same time. It has to focus on one great power war, and that great power war will be against China. But it doesn't mean that there will not be multiple fronts in the next war. It's very likely that Russia will invade Ukraine, North Korea will invade South Korea, at the same time as China invading Taiwan. But Elbridge Colby's strategy is very clear. In such a scenario, the American troops will only be used to fight China, and North Korea will have to be fought by South Korea alone. Russia will have to be fended off by Russia, the Europeans alone. So I think that's the world we're moving into. And in that sense, the traditional Japanese talking points about, we cannot increase defense spending because our financial situation is not good, or like constitutionally we are only allowed to do rear area support, this will not work. Japan has to make a decision on that. I think what Elbridge Colby is trying to convey to the Japanese is that we are going to treat Japan as a normal country, what Ichiro Ozawa always wanted. This is, I think, the new reality. That's the first point. I think J.D. Vance kind of, because of his upbringing, kind of represents the 7 swing states. The rejection of these global policeman role, these endless wars, and he saw the jobs disappearing through globalization. I think he represents MAGA. I think MAGA has moved from Trump to J.D. Vance, and I think Japan has to focus on MAGA. Second, the end of the Kishida foreign policy. I think Abe's foreign policy and Kishida's foreign policy are very different. Abe was very strategic. He held on to the tradition since the Meiji period that Japan cannot face 3-front war. It cannot face China, it cannot face the Korean Peninsula and the Soviet Union at the same time. So the long-time goal of Japanese foreign policy was to avoid multiple front wars. And that's why Abe, in his time, reached out to Putin 27 times so that he could focus on China. Luckily, during Abe's time, Trump was reaching out to North Korea, so that threat reduced. During the Abe years, Japan could focus solely on China, which is the ideal strategy. Kishida had a very different values-based approach, partly because Japan was the G7 president that year when Russia invaded Ukraine.
I think the camera
I'm sorry.
turned off.
Yeah, I'm good. I think, right? I'm sorry about that. Kishida was one of the first leaders to support Ukraine and condemn Russia. And overnight, he burned bridges with Russia. And just like that, Japan had 3-front crises. Bad relations with China, bad relations with North Korea, bad relations with Russia. But Kishida's policy was to be with Biden on a values-based, defending the rules-based international order. That really has gone out the window, I think. So Japan has to change that. That's related to, we were talking about the Indian embassy next door. The U.S.-India relationship has changed dramatically over the past few weeks. I think that's a reflection of Trump's view of China. Trump doesn't see China as a rival anymore. He sees more China as a partner to maintain stability or the order, not the rules-based international, but to maintain order. In his world, the enemy is not China and Russia, but the forces of disorder, such as Ukraine wanting to join NATO, or Israel wanting to invade Iran, or Taiwan declaring independence. These are the enemies of Trump world. Thirdly, and if China is not an enemy, then the strategic value of India decreases. That's what I think what we are seeing. Thirdly, about the bandwagoning of China, Mr. Schlesinger talked about the three options Japan has, teaming up with the middle powers and TPP. I totally agree with that. That is the most likely pattern. But then when it comes to nuclear, and like Mr. Yamaguchi said, I think nuclear is not something that the Japanese talk about or like to. That's not the preferred option. I think bandwagoning with China at the end of the day would be the preferred choice. Thank you very much.
I guess we're still in good morning time, just barely, but I'm Tim Willigan. I'll be as brief as possible. As others have noted, I also am a federal employee, so these opinions are my own and not those of DOD or any of its subordinate organizations I've been affiliated with. Many of my colleagues here have made some great points. I particularly appreciate the recent emphasis by Professor Ellis on economic opportunities. There are a couple that I find pretty encouraging. One is the opportunity for trilateral cooperation between the U.S., Japan, and Australia as far as rare earth minerals go. China pretty much has had the market cornered on that, and Australia is seeking to basically be an alternative for that. I think this is something that the U.S., Australia, and Japan should work together on in a trilateral fashion. Similarly, within our own borders here, Alaska is relatively untapped. The U.S. should encourage foreign investment, which the administration has been seeking to increase investment. They should target that towards Australia as a potential opportunity, or towards Alaska as an opportunity, one for investment in the U.S., but to wean ourselves off of China in terms of all natural resources resident in Alaska. But mostly I want to lean on my own experience and talk about cyber. Cyber is one area we've talked a lot about gray zone tactics. You could make a pretty good argument that China's been operating outside of gray zone tactics as it pertains to the cyber domain. And in one instance, it actually affected Japan in 2020. The PLA compromised classified Japanese defense networks. This has, obviously was of concern to the U.S. national security apparatus, and in large part drove us to the recent adoption of an active cyber defense law within Japan, which is encouraging because U.S., with all the forces that we have in Japan, we rely on Japanese unclassified infrastructure, to ride our own networks off of. So this is vital to U.S. moving forward. Many of the threats that the U.S. has faced over the last several years, the typhoons, for those unfamiliar, Typhoon is a Microsoft naming convention. You have Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon. Both are very proficient cyber threat actors, or MCAs as we call them in the cyber world, state actors. Yet they have unique objectives. Volt Typhoon is most interested in, very stealthily infiltrating critical infrastructure. So for when it comes time for conflict, they could bring down their infrastructure, which would have a destabilizing effect on the populace. Imagine if they struck at water in either the U.S. or Japan. Now the people are more concerned about water. They may not care so much about a straight invasion of Taiwan. Salt Typhoon is a little bit more visible. They also target infrastructure, but they target telecommunications infrastructure. In particular, that is what we're talking about when we are really trying to eradicate Salt Typhoon from that infrastructure in both the U.S. and Japan, so that we can operate our own, carry out our operations there. So I think that is, strengthening cooperation. with Japan in the cyberspace realm is vital. Moving forward, that is a domain every bit as much as air, land, or sea, or space, as others have mentioned. And Japan needs increased capabilities that the U.S. can help provide. We can conduct research to close the gap in AI, cloud solutions, and so forth. So once again, I thank you for your time and opportunity. I don't want to take up any more of the short time we have, and I'll stand by for questions after if anyone has any. Thank you.
Thanks to the panelists. Like I said, we unfortunately are out of time for questions, formal questions. However, they'll be around afterwards as well. I know Dr. Ellis has to leave for another engagement, but the other two will be around. So if you have any questions or want to discuss anything further, feel free to grab them informally. I'll just make a few closing remarks. And actually, I was joking with Indu last night that the historian gets the last word. So I do appreciate that. And it's been a great discussion. One of the things that I like to do in my scholarship and what I do with the consortium is to study the past to inform the present, but also potentially influence the future. And so in the time that I have here, I both want to respond to some things that were brought up, but I also want to provide some additional context and perhaps some additional thoughts here as we think about where we are. I mean, first of all, why 80 years? You know, when you think about where we were 80 years ago right now, the world changed. As a matter of fact, the U.S. Joint Chiefs in 1944 said that the end of World War II and Allied victory will occasion a change in the world comparable only to the fall of Rome in 476. And when you think about it, much of the world, 1945 is yesterday. And I would argue, and we could do a whole conference on this, is the geopolitical ramifications of the memory of the Pacific War. But we won't get into that right now. But it's worth mentioning, that's 80 years ago. It's amazing what was built on the ashes of the Pacific War, certainly on the ashes of the Japanese home islands. And so that's kind of the first comment that I want to make, or the first thing that we should think about is where we are versus where we were 8 decades ago. And where we are is not inevitable. Where we are was created by the decisions of leaders and the consistent commitment of governments and leaders, military, civil, on all sides. And that's what it will take to move this alliance forward and to continue to sustain this important alliance. Leadership absolutely made the difference. I would also argue, we've pointed out the long-standing training or the long-standing stationing of U.S. forces in Japan since 1945, since Douglas MacArthur, actually 80 years ago, a week from tomorrow, or a week from today, on August 29th, 1945, landed at Atsugi. But also the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. written Constitution, which unamended governs Japan to this day. And we touched on one of the more, from a security standpoint, one of the more important articles in that Constitution, which was, of course, Article 9, and the reinterpretation and what that has meant and continues to mean over the last 10 years. And I think that remains vital. But the reason I bring those up is because it shows how the United States and Japan since 1945 have been joined hand in glove, and continue to be hand in glove. And it's worth remembering that. With all the discussion we've had, with everything else that we have going on, it's worth remembering what a remarkable thing this alliance is and continues to be, and where it came from. As I mentioned before, it was absolutely not inevitable. Dr. Dombrowski, who unfortunately has jumped off, referred to Japan as the linchpin of the American alliance system in the last 80 years in the Pacific. I would call it the keystone. Whichever analogy you use, it means the same thing. And it remains so to this day. That's why this is such an important conversation. That's why this project is so important. And that's why this alliance remains so important for both sides. And just as a quick historical note, just to illustrate the importance of Japan to the United States, if you've ever seen the photo of the Marines going over the seawall at Incheon 75 years ago next month, where they're climbing ladders to go over. Does anybody know where the ladders came from? They were loaned by the Tokyo Fire Department. Which says, A, how improvised the operation was, but B, says a great deal. You know, and one of the things that several of my historian colleagues have pointed out is that, you know, we talk all about the Chinese in Manchuria and the off-limits base in Manchuria. Well,
The United Nations had the same thing in the Japanese home islands during the Korean War. And that fact bears repeating because we stand on that legacy to this day. I want to reference just real quick a few comments that were made or provide some additional perspective to some points that were made today. First of all, Dr. Yamaguchi talked about alliances, and he talked about some of the potential fragmentation and potential shifting relatively, particularly when you have a dominant power and a variety of, for lack of a better term, smaller partners or lesser partners that kind of orbit the main power. And then they're all confronted with a rising power. My historian colleagues and I have been talking for the last 10 years that we're in the 1930s in Asia, like all over again. There are a lot of very broad parallels, but I would also argue that there's a very broad parallel to the 1930s in Europe. When you consider the rise of Germany, and you had all the Eastern European powers that were dependent upon their security guarantees from Britain and France, that because of governmental instability in London and particularly in Paris, ended up not coming to be fruition. As a matter of fact, my Polish family is here in the United States because that alliance system failed. And my grandfather in the Polish Army in 1939, you can fill in the rest for sure. But I think that's a warning. And I think that's something that, if you're looking for something that takes this conversation from the purely theoretical into the more concrete, that is something you can point to for sure. Professor Sato, I've already touched on the reinterpretation of Article 9, and I will simply add to what you said, is that a study of the Pacific War from the military perspective, it's a tremendous laboratory for joint warfare, but it's also a tremendous laboratory for understanding. It's really the last time and one of the only times that modern military powers have had to confront the geography and the geopolitical realities of fighting a war in the Pacific and managing the distances of the Pacific. And so I think what you had to say was right on. I would only emphasize that stuff further. And then Ken, I loved what you said about the J.D. Vance and swing states. I actually live in one of those swing states, and I think what you said there is on to something. I will simply point out, and I've touched on this already in the historical memory, but this is one of those where historical memory matters, maybe not in a way that we expect. J.D. Vance is the first president or vice president of the United States to be a military veteran since George W. Bush left office in 2008. George W. Bush is the only Vietnam-era veteran that has been elected to one of those two offices. Before that, it was all World War II or prior. Vance is obviously not a Vietnam veteran. He's Iraq and Afghanistan. And there are, if you look at a lot of the other members of this administration that have worn the uniform, that is their war. That is their memory. And we were talking before this about how working with veterans in Wisconsin, the fall of Kabul really had an impact, continues to have an impact. And some of my Vietnam veteran friends have reached out to them to kind of commiserate. But that is, for that generation, Iraq and Afghanistan and the fall of Kabul are their defining events. And so I think it's very perceptive to point out, we talk about historical memory in the context of the Pacific War, but historical memory for these policymakers and what their formative experiences were, in this case, Iraq and Afghanistan, I think you're onto something there, particularly as you think about J.D. Vance as the potential next leader of the Republican Party and what all that means. So I think you're onto something. I want to conclude real quick by addressing the question that Jacob Schlesinger asked at the very beginning. And I think you've already been offered several very good answers, and they were great questions to pose. I will simply say this, is that we're at an inflection point in the alliance. I think that's crystal clear in all the conversations that we've had today. And for my money, the only thing that is predictable about where we're going is it's not predictable. I say the next 2 to 5 years will probably decide a lot, and we've identified today several factors that may potentially orient the alliance and push it in certain directions. But as a historian, I always like to find something that may provide some reassurance or may provide some perspective. And as I think about other alliances that may have gone through inflection points and things like this, I come back to the United States, two of the United States' more important European alliances. First of all, our long alliance with France and the ebb and flow that has taken. sometimes quite a bit of ebb, sometimes quite a bit of flow, but also the U.S.-UK special relationship. You know, for all the celebration of the special relationship, there was also Indochina in 1954, where Churchill basically intervened to prevent the United States from going in to save Dien Bien Phu, and then, of course, Suez in 1956. But the point is, those alliances survived those, they endured, and they continued to move forward. And as long as those fundamentals are there, that gives me some optimism for the future. Maybe realism for the short term, but over the long term, it gives me some optimism and some confidence for the future. So I know I'm all that stands between us and lunch, so I will stop there, but I simply will say thank you everybody for being here today. Thank you to our sponsors. This has been a fantastic discussion. I hope you all have enjoyed it and gotten as much out of it as I have. And if you want to see some more great stuff, come visit us at Indo-PacificResearchers.org. And please let's continue the conversation. And so with that, unless you have anything else, I'll bring up Indu to actually bring us to a close. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Chris. And we concluded it here. I once again thank you to the consortium team, to our contributors, and to our consortium mentors and advisors, and particularly the U.S. Japan Foundation. Mr. Jacob Schlesinger is with us, and all through this, and you gave us the time, and I hope I can say that it's a successful event today. So, and we will keep doing this discussion with the resources that we have, because the consortium is focused on the Indo-Pacific affairs. So keep in touch and stay tuned to our website and social media page for the upcoming photos and video recordings of this event. And I would like to request Colonel Holman and Jose, please, Jose, I can't see you. So we will have a group picture here and the last